Empires are often remembered for their generals, their conquests, and the banners that flew above distant capitals. Yet behind every legion, every fleet, every triumphal arch, there stood something quieter and more decisive: a treasury. Long before the modern language of central banks, sovereign bonds, and reserve currencies, the earliest empires discovered a truth that would echo through centuries of UK finance history. Power rests not merely on force, but on finance. Consider the transformation from scattered city-states to vast territorial dominions. Conquest alone could seize land, but only money could hold it. Roads had to be built, garrisons paid, administrators appointed, tributes collected and converted into usable wealth. Without a system to measure, store, and redistribute value, expansion would collapse under its own weight. The rise of early empires was, at its core, a financial revolution. One of the earliest and most striking examples emerges in the reign of Darius I of Persia. Governing a realm that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean, Darius faced a problem that would later confront Rome and Britain alike. How do you administer diversity at scale? His answer was not simply military oversight, but monetary standardization. By introducing a reliable gold coinage, the daric, and enforcing a structured tax system across provinces, he created a predictable fiscal architecture. Tribute was no longer arbitrary. It was assessed, recorded, and paid in recognized value. In effect, he transformed conquest into revenue. The same pattern can be observed in the expansion of the Roman Empire. Rome's genius did not lie solely in battlefield discipline, but in its capacity to turn territory into taxable productivity. Provinces were surveyed, land was measured. Taxes were assessed in coin. Soldiers were paid in standardized currency, reinforcing loyalty not merely to Rome's generals, but to its monetary system. The empire's silver denarius became more than a coin, became a symbol of order and authority. Confidence in that currency bound distant regions into a single economic organism. This was the first great secret of empire. Uniform money creates uniform power. A stable currency reduces friction. It enables long-distance trade. It permits governments to borrow against future revenues. Most importantly, it fosters trust. And trust, far more than gold itself, is the invisible infrastructure of empire. Centuries later, Britain would inherit and refine these lessons. The British Empire economy did not arise in isolation. It was built upon an accumulated understanding that military might must be underwritten by credible finance. The pound sterling would eventually function as a global unit of account, not because Britain conquered the seas alone, but because its financial institutions projected reliability. The roots of that credibility stretch back to these early experiments in monetary centralization and disciplined taxation. What distinguishes rising empires from fleeting conquerors is not the size of their armies, but the sophistication of their ledgers. Early rulers learned to separate personal wealth from state revenue. They developed administrative hierarchies capable of recording obligations and enforcing payment. They understood, even if instinctively, the power of regular taxation over sporadic plunder. Plunder enriches today. Taxation sustains tomorrow. Yet embedded within this innovation was a latent vulnerability. Once expansion depends upon structured revenue and organized debt, stagnation becomes dangerous. When growth slows, obligations remain. The very financial machinery that enables ascent can, under strain, signal decline. This pattern, innovation, expansion, overextension, would later define debates around pound sterling, debt cycles, and the long arc of empire decline in Britain itself. The story of early empires is therefore not merely ancient history. It is the foundation of a recurring pattern linking money and power across centuries. To understand how Britain rose to financial supremacy and why even the mightiest systems falter, we must begin where imperial finance itself began, with the discovery that true sovereignty lies not just in territory, but in the credibility of a currency and the discipline of a state's accounts. If the rise of early empires depended upon vision and conquest, their survival depended upon mechanics, the disciplined architecture of money itself. Behind imperial grandeur lay systems of taxation, currency control, and debt management that transformed scattered revenues into sustained power. These were not abstract ideas. They were practical instruments, refined over centuries, that allowed rulers to convert territory into predictable income. The first essential mechanism was standardized currency. In fragmented economies, trade is slow and taxation uncertain. Barter cannot sustain empire. By introducing uniform coinage, rulers imposed a shared measure of value across vast distances. Under Darius I, the Persian Empire minted gold darics and silver siglos, coins of reliable weight and purity. This was not merely monetary convenience. It was political consolidation. Provincial governors could collect tribute in recognized currency, and the central authority could redeploy that revenue efficiently. Standardization reduced leakage, corruption, and confusion. The Roman Empire refined this principle further. Rome developed a layered fiscal system. Land taxes, customs duties, and provincial levies flowed into imperial coffers. The denarius became the backbone of commerce from Britain to Syria. Soldiers were paid in coin, merchants traded in coin, and taxes were demanded in coin. By insisting on monetary payment, Rome ensured continuous demand for its currency, reinforcing both loyalty. The empire's financial coherence rested on the credibility of its silver. Taxation, however, was only one side of the equation. The true sophistication of empire lay in the relationship between revenue and expenditure. Armies required regular payment. Infrastructure required investment. Naval fleets required maintenance. Early empires understood that irregular windfalls from conquest could not sustain permanent commitments. Predictability was everything. This need for predictability gave rise to early forms of state borrowing. While classical empires relied heavily on tribute and plunder, later imperial systems increasingly turned to credit. Merchant banking families in Renaissance Italy demonstrated that governments could borrow against anticipated tax income. The logic was simple yet transformative. Future revenue could be mobilized today. Debt became an instrument of expansion rather than a mark of weakness. Britain would later institutionalize this insight in a way that reshaped global finance. The establishment of the Bank of England created a permanent mechanism for managing government debt. Unlike earlier rulers who defaulted unpredictably, Britain developed funded national debt, long-term obligations backed by parliamentary taxation. Investors purchased government bonds with confidence that interest would be paid. This credibility lowered borrowing costs and enabled sustained military engagement across continents. The mechanics were subtle but powerful. By converting uncertain war expenditure into structured debt instruments, Britain spread the financial burden across generations. Bond markets absorbed shock. Taxes serviced interest. The pound sterling gained stature not only because Britain traded widely, but because its debt was trusted. Trust transformed paper promises into liquid capital. Yet these systems required discipline. Currency integrity had to be preserved. When Rome faced fiscal strain, emperors gradually debased the silver content of the denarius. In the short term, this created liquidity. In the long term, it eroded confidence. Inflation followed. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Tax burdens increased. Monetary shortcuts undermined stability. The lesson embedded in these early systems is clear. Empire finance rests on credibility. Uniform coinage, structured taxation, institutionalized debt, each depends upon belief in the state's capacity to honor obligations. When that belief strengthens, expansion accelerates. When it falters, fragility spreads. Across centuries of UK finance history, the same mechanics recur. The British Empire economy relied on centralized revenue collection, disciplined public credit, and a globally trusted currency. These were not accidental advantages. They were the culmination of lessons first tested by ancient rulers who discovered that administrative precision, not mere conquest, sustains power. The machinery of empire, therefore, was financial before it was military. Armies marched because accounts balanced. Fleets sailed because bonds were sold. The ledger was as decisive as the sword. History doesn't just repeat itself, it rhymes. And nowhere is this more true than in the epic sagas of empires, whose stories of glory and collapse are often written in the language of money. Today, let us journey back through time to witness the rise and fall of two titans, the Roman and British empires. Seen through the revealing lens of their financial systems, picture this: ancient Rome, a sprawling empire built on military might and engineering marvels. In its golden age, the silver denarius was the dollar of its day, a symbol of stability and trust across the known world. This financial innovation fueled trade, funded legions, and built the aqueducts and roads we still admire. But as the empire expanded, so did its expenses. Wars on distant frontiers, lavish spending by emperors, and the infamous bread and circuses to keep the populace happy began to strain the treasury. What's an emperor to do? Instead of raising taxes and risking revolt, they chose a sneakier path: debasement. They started mixing cheaper metals, like copper, into their silver coins. A little at first, then a lot. Imagine getting paid with a coin that's supposed to be pure silver, only to find it's mostly junk. People weren't fooled for long. They hoarded the old, pure coins and tried to get rid of the new, debased ones. Prices skyrocketed. A soldier's pay, once enough to support a family, could barely buy a loaf of bread. This hyperinflation wasn't just an economic problem, it was a social catastrophe. Trust in the government evaporated. The economy ground to a halt. The once mighty Roman financial system, the very bedrock of its power, crumbled, paving the way for the empire's eventual fall. It's a powerful lesson. When a nation's money loses its credibility, the nation itself is not far behind. Fast forward about 1,500 years. A new empire has risen, one on which the sun never sets. The British Empire. Its currency, the pound sterling, backed by gold, was the new global standard. London was the financial capital of the world. Britain's financial innovation wasn't debasing coins, but mastering a new, powerful tool: public debt. By selling government bonds, they could finance a world-class navy and fund colossal industrial projects, building a global trading network that brought immense wealth back home. For a long time, this system worked brilliantly. But just like Rome, the costs of maintaining a global empire, especially through two devastating world wars, became overwhelming. Britain borrowed heavily, particularly from the United States, to fund the war effort. After World War II, the empire was victorious but financially shattered. The pound, once unshakable, faced multiple crises. The nation was deep in debt. Its industries were struggling to compete, and the cost of managing its vast overseas territories was crippling. In 1947 and again in 1967, Britain was forced to devalue the pound. Each devaluation was a blow to its prestige and a signal to the world that its economic dominance was over. The once mighty pound sterling lost its status as the world's primary reserve currency to the US dollar. As the financial pillar weakened, the political empire began to dismantle. One by one, colonies sought and gained independence. The decline of the British Empire was a slow, complex process. But the loss of monetary credibility and the crushing weight of debt were undeniably at its core. From Roman denarii to the British pound, the story is strikingly similar. Financial innovation fuels the rise, but financial strain precedes the fall. Whether through printing worthless money or piling up unsustainable debt, when an empire loses control of its finances, it loses the trust of its people and its rivals. Monetary credibility isn't just an abstract economic concept. It's the lifeblood of power. As we look at the world today, These stories from Rome and Britain serve as a timeless and crucial reminder of the fragile link between a nation's wallet and its fate. History has shown us the script. The question is, are we paying attention? Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through financial history interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that connect the past to our present. Across centuries and civilizations, a consistent pattern emerges. Empires rise when they master money, and they decline when they mismanage it. The details differ. Gold derricks, silver denarii funded national debt, or pound sterling, yet the underlying structure remains strikingly familiar. Financial innovation precedes expansion. Monetary credibility sustains authority. Debt, when disciplined, magnifies power. When discipline weakens, fragility spreads. The earliest imperial architects understood that conquest without fiscal order is fleeting. Standardized currency created economic unity. Predictable taxation funded administration. Organized credit accelerated expansion. These mechanisms allowed empires to transcend geography and bind distant territories into coherent systems of exchange. Money became the silent language of authority. Britain's experience, central to UK finance history, demonstrates how these ancient lessons were refined into modern institutions. By institutionalizing public credit through the Bank of England, Britain transformed sovereign borrowing into a permanent and credible structure. The state could wage prolonged wars, build naval supremacy, and finance infrastructure without immediate collapse. Investors trusted parliamentary taxation to service debt. That trust lowered borrowing costs and strengthened the British Empire economy. The pound sterling, in time, became more than a domestic currency. It evolved into a global unit of account and reserve asset. Merchants across continents settled trade in sterling, not because Britain demanded it by force, but because its financial system projected stability. London emerged as a center of banking power, coordinating flows of capital across imperial and global networks. Here, the connection between money and power reached its most sophisticated expression: geopolitical influence underwritten by credible finance. Yet the same structural logic warns against complacency. Debt cycles are double-edged. When borrowing funds productive expansion, growth sustains repayment. When borrowing compensates for stagnation, pressure accumulates. Over-financialization, the reliance on complex credit structures detached from underlying productivity, can weaken resilience. Confidence, once eroded, is difficult to restore. The broader lesson is neither triumphalist nor alarmist. It is analytical. Monetary credibility rests upon three pillars: fiscal discipline, institutional trust, and economic vitality. Remove one, and the structure trembles. Remove two, and it begins to fracture. Early empires faltered when currency debasement undermined confidence. Modern powers confront analogous challenges when inflation, excessive leverage, or policy inconsistency cloud credibility. This pattern extends beyond any single nation. From ancient Persia to Rome to Britain, financial centralization has preceded periods of expansion. Administrative sophistication enabled scale. Debt markets mobilized resources rapidly. But when obligations multiplied faster than output, adjustment became unavoidable. The shift may be gradual, unfolding over decades, yet its direction is clear. Understanding this rhythm reframes how we interpret empire decline. It is not merely the story of military defeat or political upheaval. It is the quieter narrative of balance sheets strained by ambition. The ledger often reveals stress before the battlefield does. When yields rise, when reserves dwindle, when currency volatility increases, these are signals of deeper transition. For contemporary observers interested in money and power, the lesson is measured but profound. Reserve currencies endure through trust. Banking power depends upon credibility. Economic leadership requires both innovation and restraint. The rise of early empires demonstrates how financial systems can unlock extraordinary reach. Their decline illustrates how fragile that reach becomes when discipline erodes. In the end, the most enduring empires are not those that conquer the most land, but those that maintain confidence the longest. Sovereignty at its core is financial before it is territorial. The sword may establish dominion, but only stable money sustains it. And when the credibility of that money weakens, history shows that power, however formidable, begins its quiet migration elsewhere.